welcome back everybody. My name is Mike Jesh and I'm a member of Cal Pilots. Our next speaker is my friend Captain Gary Schank. Gary is a retired former Northwest, former Delta captain. He's currently instructing for a couple other airlines. So he'll give you the full details on that. He is also the region, I believe, 6 vice president for Cal Pilots. That's the southern portion of the state. Basically Orange County and everything south and east of that. So he has got a great presentation in store for us today on transitioning from analog flight instruments over to digital. So Gary, take it away.
Great, thank you, Mike. Okay, just a little preliminary stuff here. The door prizes, are available still. So be sure if you're not a member, you could sign up and still potentially get a door prize. Julie will be announcing that later on. This is Wings credit available. So all you have to do for that is if you've already signed up with your email that you use for Wings credit, you've got that. And there's no action required there. And of course, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A, not the chat. So here we are. You have the keynote speaker. I guess what you're left with is the sour note speaker. So here we go. Okay. Just a little bit on my background. As Mike mentioned, I flew airlines, but I learned on GA. I learned in a Cessna 150. I retired on the Boeing 737, a glass cockpit. And then the Bonanza that I have recently was upgraded to a modest glass cockpit as well. So I am flying glass, I guess, in both places now, but learned on analog like most people out there, right? Yeah. All right. And by the way, as you can see, just a little bit more on my background, what I'm doing, I'll let you know in a second there, but I also do practice law. And so I guess between being an airline pilot, a New Yorker, and an attorney, I have something anybody could hate, right? All right, these are some of the other airplanes I flew when I was over there. And I did teach on the DC-9. I was a line check airman and instructor on that airplane. I did fly the Airbuses, the baby buses we call the A320, and then the A330 as well, mostly over the ponds with that. So, and then you could see the bowling shoe paint job on the 727 when it was still Northwest Airlines. Yeah. So anyway, I really didn't want to give up commercial flying, as Mike mentioned. And so I'm flying for this, what's called a schedule. It's an air carrier scheduled charter. On this, I thought I was done with my type ratings, but this was my 6th type rating on this Embraer, which I'm flying now for JSX. And so you can see it's a pretty decent glass cockpit. It's not the latest technology glass cockpit, but it's a glass cockpit. So pretty decent. And it's a nice airplane to fly, kind of has a heavy feel like a bigger airplane. So it's kind of fun flying it. So that's what I'm doing now. Well, people say that there's a saying, I speak a little Mandarin, and people say that the symbols for change is both danger and opportunity in Chinese. That's actually not exactly accurate. A Gaiban is actually how the pronunciation for it. Although that's not exactly accurate, I think that the statement is accurate, that whenever there's a change, there's both a danger, but there's also an opportunity there, right? So in our case, the opportunity with a glass cockpit is you have a lower workload, you have less fatigue, you have more economy of movement, you have new and enhanced approaches that you could do, like LPV approaches, that sort of thing, much more information. But on the other hand, you have to learn a new way to fly, a new way to scan your instruments, a new way to do those approaches, right? And you have to be careful about complacency, because along with a glass cockpit comes automation. And we'll talk a little bit about that automation a little bit later. Okay, well, when I did my transition from analog to glass, this is what I was flying. My first analog to glass, I was flying the DC-9, which was the most archaic airliner at the time. And I ended up getting a bid to go to the Airbus A320, which was the most advanced aircraft of the time. Now you look at these two airplanes, flying this is very different than flying this, okay? And it was quite a transition, and I knew it would be, so I studied really very, very hard to learn this before I ever got to class. And because I knew this was my first one and it really was all new to me, so I really wanted to learn it. It's a wonderful airplane, but it's very different. It doesn't fly like this flies, right? Okay, and here's what you have to realize. You kind of go through a learning curve, and you have to do that when you transition from analog to glass. And let's face it, most airplanes that even that we fly are going to be transitioning from analog to glass. You know, it used to be that the airlines had much more advanced systems and avionics than the airliners. That's no longer true. You could buy some really nice stuff for GA airplanes these days. And in many cases, it's better than what the airlines are flying. So that's no longer the case, but you do go through this kind of learning curve, right? And first, oh yeah, well, glass, that looks great, you know, and then you realize, yikes, this is not easy and I don't really know what I'm doing. And then you think you start to get it, but then you know what you don't know. So you're just like, yikes, I've got a lot more to learn. And then it starts to make sense. And then finally, like anything, you master it and it's great. You can do it and it's wonderful, but it does take that learning curve to go through, right? Okay. So one thing to realize with when you're transitioning from steam to glass, as we call it steam, right, is that the traditional instruments tend to operate autonomously. Each one sort of does its own independent thing, and you look at it and get the information from it, and that's it. But in a glass airplane, the components all tend to be kind of looking at each other and getting information from each other. So there's a lot more interaction between the components and the systems than there might be on a traditional airplane. You kind of have to get that concept down. Okay. Okay. So, I mean, look at this. Let's say, you know, one of these is your airplane, okay? And that's your airplane, and then you go and get glass, right? Is it the same airplane to fly, right? Is that airplane? I mean, when you walk up to it from the outside, it's the same airplane, right? But is it really the same airplane to fly anymore? And I submit to you that it's not. I mean, let's say this was your cockpit, okay? And let's say somebody was wonderful enough while you were sleeping to sneak out to the airport and plop $120,000 down and overnight manage to get your cockpit to transition to this. And then you come up to your airplane and like, yikes, somebody messed with my airplane. Would you be able to just hop in and fly away the same way you did the day before? And obviously the answer is no. There's something to learn now, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. You know, two questions that airline pilots always ask when they're flying glass airplanes is, one of them is, why are these fingerprints on the glass? You know, it amazes me. I get into the 737 and there's fingerprints all over the screens. These are not touch screens. There's no reason to touch these, but for some reason there's fingerprints. I'm always taking off, you know. If I wanted to look at fingerprints, I would have joined the FBI, you know. But anyway, the next thing that they're always asking is, what's it doing now, right? Everybody goes through that transition when they go to glass, like, what's this airplane doing now? It's kind of doing its own thing, okay? So today, hopefully, we're going to look at ways to avoid what's it doing now. Okay. All right. Now, with the traditional six-pack, you always want to treat I do a whole thing just on instruments, and you always want to treat your attitude indicator as the hub. No matter what else you do, the next thing you do is look at your attitude indicator. When you do that, you never get that far out of whack, right? But you're used to looking at these other instruments and then comparing to what your attitude is and kind of getting what you want out of them. Well, the same thing does apply with glass. I mean, you still need to use that attitude indicator as your primary hub and looking at the other instruments. But there's a little bit of a difference in that when you look at an airspeed indicator, if you're looking at kind of the round dials, as we call it, right? You're sort of used to seeing that needle in a given place. Well, that doesn't happen now with the digital instrument. It's more of a tape, chances are. And so you're now looking at a numerical value, not a place where that needle is necessarily, right? Okay, same thing with the altitude, right? You know, if you're flying IFR, pretty much those needles are pointing up. If you're flying VFR, one of them's pointing up and one of them's pointing down, right? So it's kind of a visual thing that you could look at. But in the glass airplane, again, it's a numerical value. It's a digital, right? And the same thing now with your attitude, you do still look at it in a traditional way, but sometimes you have even more of a horizon to look at, and that's kind of a big help, right? So you do still have that kind of information to look at. And I'm going to be going, by the way, through some things quickly and then later on something slowly, because I want to emphasize those. Right. But again, we're looking at digital versus analog, and you're looking how your scan tends to change. And it takes a few months actually to get used to that. Because look at this, especially a vertical speed indicator. You're used to that needle up or down, right? Meaning I'm going up or I'm going down. Whereas now I'm looking at a negative 400 to see that 400 foot per minute descent. So it's a different way to look at it. Now, I met a guy who got a Garmin and he said, hey, look, you know, this is great because being that it's a screen, you could program it for round dials if you want to on that. So if you want to go to keep it traditional instruments, you can do that. But I'll say this, okay? You could put off-road tires on a Ferrari, but should you? Okay, so I would suggest that if you're going to the new modern instruments, go to the new modern instruments. Yes, it'll take you a little bit of a transition, but you know, enjoy the new experience of it. And in the long run, I think you're better off looking at the new digital instruments the way they're meant to be, right? All right, but the thing that the other side of that coin is, it's information overload in a lot of cases. I notice a lot of pilots when they go to class, boy, there's so much there. What do you look at, right? And it's interesting how as you get more comfortable with looking at the glass, your mind filters out what you don't really need at the moment, right? So for instance, you know, if you won't know you're on your flight management system that you're operating and you don't really need it, you sort of filter it out. If you don't have traffic, that's a factor at this moment. Your traffic advisories and radar advisories, which you may have or may not have, are not necessarily something you need to look at. So you learn to sort of filter things out, okay, as you need them. Okay, another thing that's a little bit of an oddity, you know, we're used to stepping on the ball for that coordinated flight. And with a digital instrument, they may have this little guy up here. Sometimes they say you sort of put the sail over the sailboat or you sort of step on the brick, right? So you're using that to sort of make that coordinated flight instead of a ball sometimes, okay? It depends on the symbology. I have to say that sometimes I tend to find this a little bit subtle, a little bit tougher to look at, you know. You get used to it, but it is a little bit more subtle. This is what I have in my airplane, and you could see it's digitally produced, but nevertheless, it's a little ball at the bottom, kind of like you're used to looking at, right? So in this case, it's a little bit more, let's call it traditional view of your turn coordinator, right? Okay. All right. Now, one of the nice things, of course, with the glass cockpit is you get some information that you wouldn't otherwise get. You know, you look at this and you could see an artificial simulated terrain out there. And generally speaking, in the digital world, green good, yellow not so good, red bad, right? So in this case, we have green, which is terrain well below us. We have the mountains out there, which are close to our altitude. And of course, we saw that terrain out there red, and we continued on our current altitude and heading, we'd hit it. Right, so that's good information to have, right? Okay, and then of course we obviously have our maps and things like that, or our charts, I should say, and that's kind of a bird's eye view. But I'm not going to get heavy into that because we already are looking at those things a lot. Many of us already have GPSs. Even if you don't, if you look at a chart, you're basically looking at a paper version of a bird's eye view. So that's not what I'm really going to be talking about today as much as I am about the symbology and how to use the glass to navigate, that sort of thing. But we do have the benefits, of course, of that sort of technology, and it's wonderful. Right? Follow that magenta line, right? And it's really a very nice way to fly. I just came back from Santa Maria a couple of days ago, Solvang. You know, Mike Jesh referred to that earlier and talking about interesting places to fly. And that is a great place to fly. So it was really good. But I followed that magenta line. I was able to get direct, you know, do that sort of thing. So it's got a lot of nice features, obviously, to that. But that's not what we're focusing on today. All right. If you get nothing else out of today, these are the words to live by. Okay, you must make monitoring your flight mode annunciator a priority. This is a new part of your scan. You need to understand what the airplane is doing. This is how you don't go, what's it doing now, right? And you need to understand what mode you're in. So you were looking at this, and we'll get into this symbology, but obviously this airplane, we know that it's heading toward from the final approach fix to the runway in this case. We see our distance, we see that we're in the GPS mode, and we see that the autopilot and yaw damper are on, right? So all that information is available to us. That's letting us understand what our airplane is doing, and so we can expect what's going to happen. Okay, you know, we have a saying in the airlines, we look up at the autopilot and say, this is rumor. And then we look at the flight mode annunciator and say, this is fact. Okay, and that's what applies to you too. We're going to get into the autopilots later on. But again, that flight mode annunciator is what the airplane is actually doing. That's the mode the airplane is actually in. And it's very important that that becomes a critical part of your scan. All right. So, you know, this is more a GA airplane. This happens to be the autopilot that we have in our airplane. Wonderful. But again, the same thing applies. When you press a button on that autopilot, a little light lights up above that particular button. Does that mean that's what you got? Maybe. But this is going to tell you if, in fact, you got what you asked for, right? And that's the way it is in life, right? Just because you ask for it doesn't mean you get it, right? Okay. So you want to look at all these things. What's the altitude I'm at versus what's the altitude I've been assigned or I'm flying towards? What mode is my nav in, right? These are all things to know. So loc mode, yep, I look up at my flight mode annunciator. Yes, I'm in the loc mode. Oh, I've got a glide slope diamond there indicating, am I in the mode where my airplane is going to intercept the glide slope? Yep, it's in that mode. So I'm confirming what I want and what the airplane's doing. And that's a very critical thing when you're flying glass. Okay. Again, the loc mode, it matches, makes sense. Okay, here's the beauty of what you can do. You know, we talked about the needles earlier. Where the needles are, they are. You have to kind of watch it for a while to see a trend. But the beauty with glass is that you could see the future. How can I do that? How can I see the future? Well, if you look, you'll notice on the airspeed, it's 108 knots, but you'll see that little magenta line above the 108. What is that telling you? It's telling you that's the trend of your airspeed. So you get to see a trend. In this case, I believe this instrument gives you 8 seconds in advance, or it might be 6. I'm not sure which on this particular instrument. In airliners, it's 10, but I'm seeing a trend on my airspeed. So I'm able to see the future, right? Okay, and if you look at your altitude, you could see that you're at 1,600 feet, but that little magenta tick mark is below, which is indicating that you're trending a lower altitude. Doesn't that make sense? Right? You tip the airplane over, you're going to descend, but your airspeed's going to pick up, assuming you don't change the throttle position, right? So that all makes sense, and that goes towards your scan, of course. So the beauty is you get a trend information that you don't necessarily get when you take that one second glance at a round dial instrument. Okay, let's talk a little bit about colors, because color is very important when you're looking at glass instruments. Which are, generally speaking, if something on your flight mode annunciator is in green, pretty much this has become the standard. That means that's the mode the airplane is in, okay? But if it's in white, that means that's in the standby, okay? And it's armed. So let's look at this and see how that might affect us, okay? What is the status of the autopilot right now? Okay, well, we see a green AP, right? And since green means active, that means the autopilot is on, it's active, okay? What is the lateral mode? You'll notice on the left side of the display is the lateral mode, and on the right side is the vertical mode. So what is the lateral mode of this current airplane right now? Well, what's in green? We're in the heading mode, but look what's white. GPS is white. Okay, why would something like this happen? What would that mean? Well, what if ATC said, fly heading 315 to intercept Victor 186? Okay, that's an indication where you'd fly a heading. So the current mode is heading, but GPS is armed. What would happen? You'd reach that airway. You'd see that GPS go green. The airplane would turn onto the airway. It's a beautiful thing. Okay, so what lateral mode is armed? As I mentioned, that's in white. So that would be the GPS mode is armed, but we're currently in the heading mode. Okay, vertical mode. What vertical mode are we in? Well, we're in alt, right? We're locked at an altitude of 6,500 feet. However, what's in white? Glide path, right? So what does that mean? That means that if we're flying along on an approach and we're level with 6,500 feet, once we reach that glide path and we could see that diamond just starting to appear, once that diamond centers, what's going to happen? Alt goes away, GP goes green, and the airplane tips over and flies on the glide path. Again, a beautiful thing. Okay. So the color becomes very important in looking at your scan on what the airplane is doing. Okay. Okay, let's talk about color when it comes to looking at your needles. The way I like to look at it, because the needles are going to be green if it's taking a signal, what I say, it's coming up from the good green earth. That's the way I like to think of it. Whereas if it's magenta, it's magic coming down from the sky, magenta magic or good green earth, green needles, okay? So what does that mean? Well, if you're tracking a VOR or a localizer, that's a ground-based signal. So you're going to get a green needle in that case. And we can see how it says VOR right there next to the HSI, right? Whereas if you're tracking a GPS, you could expect magenta needles from that magic coming down from that GPS coming down from the sky. So that's where that color coordination works as far as that's concerned. Very important, and you'll see where later on that could be critical. All right. Another thing with the symbology is that you have to learn what the symbology of your particular instrument does. If you look here, this happens to be an Aspen, and you look and you see that right now the course deviation indicator is hollow. That means that the localizer has not been acquired yet. But as you get closer in, it turns solid. It's been acquired, right? So you need to learn the symbology of your particular avionics to see what it's actually doing. And that's a good indication right there. Okay, instrument setup. Now we talked about the color of these needles, okay? What's wrong with this picture? Well, if you look, there's your green localizer needles, which means you're getting information from the good green earth coming up, right? But what's happening on your GPS? You're in the you're tracking a GPS signal, magenta, and they don't match. You see that? So why would something like this happen? Well, you come in from your previous flight, you shot an ILS approach, you landed, you shut down the airplane, went home, and everything's fine. Now you come back out to the airplane to go fly again. Chances are when you're going to depart, you're going to be using a GPS signal, right? You're going to fly to some fix initially, whatever. You're going to be in that mode. But your last flight was bringing in that airplane on an ILS. So you have to make sure that your CDI is switched back to magenta needles, right? This is part of your pre-flight setup. When you do your pre-flight and you do your flight controls and you get into your avionics, this is part of your setup, okay? This is now a G1000. I mention this because it seems to me, I mean, whatever you get used to becomes the norm, but it seems to me sort of an illogical setup. I mean, here you have your altitude knob on the lower left. Where is normally your altitude seen? On the upper right. Seems to me the knob should have been up there, but that's not where it is on a G1000, right? And then we have a lot of our lateral information off on the left side, but where's our course indicator or our course knob? It's on the right. So it just seems to me they were kind of illogically set up. I kind of like the G500 now because what that has is a knob at the bottom, and you look at the things above it: heading, course, altitude, vertical speed, baro. they all have a line going to it. So basically, whatever button you press, that means that knob affects that particular thing. Very logical. So I kind of like that a lot. But the reality is, whatever you get used to using becomes the norm to you. But I find this to be a little bit more of a logical setup. All right. And again, you have to get familiar with your particular manufacturer. There's Dynon, there's Aspen, there's Garmin, right? There's all kinds of different avionics that you need to get used to the symbology. I like to when I'm just kind of vegging out, watching TV, pick up the book again and review things. And invariably, there's some little things. Oh yeah, that's right. Forgot about that little nuance, you know. So it's good to do that. Okay. Now, keep in mind also that you could get digital engine instruments, right? So you could have the traditional instruments that are analog, but if you go to a digital readout, that now changes too, because once again, you're used to these needles in a given place. You do have these simulated needles on this one as well, but you're more looking at a digital readout. So it's a different type of scan that you have to get used to. But again, once you get used to it, it's quite nice, and it's superior to this. It really gives you detailed information. And of course, you can modify a lot of these screens to really make them the way you want them to be. Right? But keep in mind, you do have that to deal to as a new way to look at your engine instruments. Right? Okay. And I'm going to be getting kind of heavily into this part, which is why I kind of did the first part a little fast. But, you know, one thing that is you really need to get used to your autopilot. You know, I once had somebody say to me, yeah, you airline pilots, you just click on it, push a button and watch the airplane fly. Oh, really? So I guess that means then you can do what I do, right? You could just go in that airplane, press the button and watch it fly. Well, no, I guess maybe there's a little more to it. And there is, okay? Because this is, if you don't know how to use your autopilot, and that's a skill of its own, that's a what's it doing now thing, right? Because now that autopilot may be doing something you don't want the airplane to do. You really need to understand how your autopilot works. So that's kind of a critical thing. And there's some definitely nasty things that could happen if you don't understand that, right? Keep in mind, don't forget, when all else fails, shut off the stuff and fly the airplane, right? You all know how to fly stick and rudder. So when it comes down to it, if it's not doing what you want it to do, you could always shut it off and fly it, right? Okay, so once again, remember though, that the autopilot, what the autopilot indicates is rumor, and what's on your flight mode annunciator is fact. And that's a way to keep you out of trouble, understanding what the airplane understands itself to be, that it's going to be doing. Okay. All right, so let's talk about just a little bit the different phases of flight using that automation and using the glass cockpit, right? So initially there's the takeoff go around, right? That's the button. You'd hit that toga button and your flight directors would zip up to your normal rotation attitude, right? But it varies with the autopilot, but generally speaking, an autopilot is likely to default to the roll mode and the pitch mode, because it doesn't know what you want yet, right? So the roll mode in a takeoff is normally going to be wings level. The pitch mode is going to be what it expects you to rotate to for a normal takeoff. In my airplane, at least my GA airplane, that's about 10 degrees. So that flight director comes up to 10 and expects you to bring your wings up and tuck them nicely into that flight director, right? So that's the mode that initially the autopilot's going to be in. All right. But chances are you're going to be going on a heading, possibly runway heading, or possibly an assigned heading, or possibly cleared directly to a fix. So that you can switch that to that roll mode. You can switch that to whatever mode you want it to be, indicated airspeed or vertical speed. We'll talk about that. And the pitch to whatever you want it to be as well. But just understand, again, this is what it is doing. This is what it thinks it should be doing, what it defaults to, right? Okay. This is now technique only, but in my opinion, one of the best ways to climb out with an autopilot is with the airspeed. as the primary factor there. Why is that? Well, you're pitching up, right? And if you put the autopilot in a vertical speed mode, then that's the autopilot saying, okay, you said that your top priority is this vertical speed you set. And no matter what, I'm going to maintain this vertical speed. Well, what could happen? If you're not paying attention and you picked a high vertical speed, you could potentially stall the airplane, right? So I like the idea of climbing out in an indicated airspeed mode. It also sets me up with a speed that I like that keeps my engine cool, that sort of thing, right? But I like the idea that if I set an indicated airspeed, now I'm kind of busy doing something and I momentarily don't look at my gauges, I'm not going to get far out of whack. I'm not going to stall the airplane, right? So this is, I think, a good mode for climbing out is indicated airspeed. All right, now we get up to altitude, right? Now remember, if it's green, that's the mode you're in. If it's white, that's the mode that's in standby, right? And is armed. So now let's say in this case, we have an airplane that's in the indicated airspeed mode and you set it for 100 knots. You'll notice that the tick mark, the little bug, is set at 100, right? Okay, so now that's the airspeed that is set, and we're going to stay in that indicated airspeed mode. But now we get up to 5,000 feet in this case, because if you look at the top of your airspeed indicator, that's the tick mark that you designated for your climb. So what's going to happen when we get to the altitude? I hope you're saying to yourself, well, it's going to level off at 5,000. Indicated airspeed mode goes away. Alt turns green, and I maintain my altitude, because that is what happens, right? So again, you need to understand how the airplane will transition from one mode to the next, which is exactly what you asked it to do, right? So alt, indicated airspeed goes away, alt goes green, and you're level at 5,000. Again, a beautiful thing. Okay, so now let's look at, we're now descending. So now what would I say at least is potentially the best mode to descend in? And again, this is technique only, but in my opinion, vertical speed. Because now you want to maintain a given steady descent. It's good for your engine. It's good for your passengers. It's good that ATC predicts what you're doing, right? So it's nice to set up a vertical speed. So you're going to set your autopilot for a nice vertical speed that works well for you, okay? And now keep in mind now, again, you've now determined, you've given priority to your autopilot that vertical speed is the priority. So if you do not pull your power back, it's going to maintain that, and you're probably going to be zipping your airspeed up into the yellow. So you have to keep that in mind, right? But now you can ease your, and at least in my airplane, I know every 10 inches manifold pressure is roughly 100 feet per minute descent. You can wind that back very nicely and predict it. So it's good that you can predict these things and fly by the numbers. So I like vertical speed for descent mode. But again, this is technique only. Okay, now, if you have an airplane that's more sophisticated and has VNAV capability, that is a whole subject, could easily do 1 hour on VNAV alone. Okay, but if you have that, that's probably your best mode for descent, especially because in the VNAV mode, it'll make crossing restrictions for you. Very nice. In the 737, many times we'd be out there east of Palm Springs, get a descent clearance and even cleared for the approach, and we could set it all the way down to 2,000 feet or 1,800 feet for our initial approach altitude coming into LAX. And the airplane will step down, make all the crossing restrictions, even the speed restrictions, and then make that approach very nicely. Beautiful thing. So VNAV is a whole thing of its own. But if you don't have VNAV capability, and most GA airplanes won't, then vertical speed seems to work real well. All right. Let's look at this. I want to talk about this here. Keep in mind that if you're doing a GPS approach, that is not an LPV approach. So you're providing the vertical descents, right? Now you will get this glide path information, but this is not a legal glide slope or glide path indicator for you to follow, and your autopilot will not do it for you. You have to do it. LNAV plus V is going to be the indication of that. So this is good because it gives you great guidance for making a nice, beautiful, steady descent, but you're the one that's providing the vertical guidance, right? So you're tipping it over, and we know that in our airplanes, when we're back at approach speed, about 500 feet per minute, usually works real nice. So you could set it up and then fine tune that vertical speed to make it pop the top of those crossing restrictions really nicely. So, but keep in mind, LNAV plus V, it's not going to do it for you. You are providing the vertical component. Okay, let's look at this. It's very important that in the airlines, we're required in our airline to match the heading bug with where we're going. Why do you want to do that? Well, you want to be sure that you do that because let's look at this situation. Notice that our heading bug is now some previous heading we were going, and we're now in the GPS mode. So we forgot about the heading bug. You'll notice it's slightly off to the left. Okay. And let's see what happens in a case like this. Okay. So let's say ATC says, Cessna 39 Echo, cancel approach clearance, turn left heading 330, maintain 2000. So you say, okay, hit the heading mode. What's going to happen to that airplane with that heading bug slightly to the right? Right? What's it doing now? Right? Okay, so again, you want to be sure that you understand what your airplane's doing and what mode you're in. If you match the heading bug to where you're going, and I'm constantly hitting that and slewing it, all you have to do is hit the heading bug on this, then at least now they say, go to tell you the heading. When you go into heading mode, what's going to happen? Nothing. The airplane's going to fly straight ahead, right? And now you can turn to that heading that they assigned to you, and you're going to go left, not right, right? So it's very important that you line up your heading bug with where you're going. Constantly match it up. Anytime you change heading, change your heading bug to where you're going. It'll keep you out of trouble. Okay, go around. We're now at the go around phase. So now TOGA stands for takeoff go around, right? So if you hit that TOGA button, that's what you want for takeoff, but also for the go around. It's going to bring the command bars up, and it's going to direct you to what you want to do on a go around. So that's the way that works. And so you do want to use that TOGA button for a go around, right? It's going to give you that guidance. You also, once you're on that glide path or the glide slope, and your airplane is now following that as a means of vertical navigation, that's the time to set your missed approach altitude, right? You get that airplane ahead, you keep ahead of the game, right? In this case, it's set for 10,000, but that's just what this happens to be. Let's say you're going around at Orange County or someplace, they usually want you to climb to 3,000. So once I'm on that glide slope or glide path, that's when I set my missed approach altitude, right? Okay, so you want to keep that in mind, that with these instruments, again, they're all interfacing with each other. It's not like independent instruments where each one is doing its own independent thing. They are all talking to each other, and it's very important you get that interface going. And the other thing I'll say is that you really, a lot of the battle with this is just knowing where to find things. And you can download simulators, for instance, the Garmin simulator, and that's the GPS, but it still does relate to your glass navigation. And you can get a lot of information then and practice while you're sitting home, and you don't have to worry about traffic and ATC and all the other distractions that go with flying the airplane that the Kings pointed out so well, right? So it's really good if you could, of course, being an airline guy, I'm big on simulators. Simulators are terrific. And even these simple home ones do a real nice job. All right, just to let you know, I do a lot of these talks for community aviation. Here are some of the other subjects I do. So it's my shameless self-promotion. There you go. So you can check me out on community aviation. So let's go over some things with a nice fun quiz for the whole family. So let's look at some of these just to kind of talk about some of these. Okay, generally, if the mode appears in green on an FMA, flight mode annunciator, that indicates the mode is armed. True or false? It's green. Is it armed? False. Remember, green is active. White indicates armed. Okay. Okay. Generally, if an HSI needle appears in green, that indicates it's receiving a ground-based signal. True or false? I hope you're saying true, because remember, if it's green, it's coming up. That's a signal coming up from the good green earth. If it's magenta, it's magic coming down from the sky. All right. Okay. One of the biggest benefits of the glass cockpit is that you no longer need to scan the instruments. True or false? I hope everybody knows that that's obviously false. We trust but verify, right? Very reliable, but we still have to scan our instruments. We're still the pilot in command, right? Okay. The primary flight display replaces the traditional six-pack in instrument flying. That's true, right? It provides a nice compact scan of the primary instruments. Okay, the navigation display replaces the need to monitor our position. Obviously, that's false. We still need to do our own old-fashioned navigation. I find this a lot, by the way, and I'll consider the iPad part of a glass cockpit, right? In a way, it's a screen. And a lot of times I'll see people, if I'm doing an instrument review or something, instrument flight review, say, okay, fly to the Paradise VOR, and see them going like this on the iPad. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Fly this airplane to that VOR, right? The iPad is not the primary instrument. That's a secondary thing you do later. But first you fly the airplane. All right. The best way to determine the mode of the autopilot is to verify the light on the mode of the autopilot is lit up. Well, again, that's false. Remember, the autopilot is rumor, the FMA is fact, right? Okay. If you have never uttered the words, "What's it doing now?" You've never flown a glass cockpit. That's absolutely true. Everybody does, "What's it doing now?" Right? So anyway, that's a true thing. So a few things just to talk about, then we can get into any questions or thoughts anybody would have. Okay, don't give up the scan. Okay, you still have to fly the instruments the way you always did. The attitude indicator is still the hub. You still need to do that. Okay. Trust but verify the autopilot. They usually do the right thing, but that doesn't mean they always do the right thing, right? So again, the autopilot is rumor. What the FMA says is fact. Critical part of your new scan, that's now part of your scan. Constantly monitoring what the flight mode annunciator is saying. Okay, get used to the new scan before getting into heavy IFR. You know, again, it's the same airplane on the outside, but on the inside, it's a whole new airplane. So I would definitely start shooting approaches and doing things in VFR conditions and get really comfortable with your instruments before you start biting off IFR. Okay, definitely embrace the new technology, but don't become overly dependent on it. Ultimately, like I said before, you know, if it's not doing what you want it to do, or if you're not sure how to get it to do it, shut it off and just fly the airplane, right? I'd say almost all of us learned on airplanes that never had autopilots, right? Okay. When in doubt, like I said, shut it off, fly the airplane, okay? Glass cockpits often interface, know the relationship between the instruments, okay? And please, keep your fingers off the glass if you don't have a touch screen. So those are the basics, I would say, with getting into glass. If you have any thoughts, I'd sure like to hear what anybody has to say or any experiences anybody has had flying glass. So with that, I'll open it up to the forum, Mike. Mike, and you need to unmute yourself. I still don't hear you for some reason, Mike.
I pushed it twice. It's still not working.
Yeah,
Okay.
and could we see you, please,
Yeah,
Gary?
Gary, your
Oh.
camera apparently is not working now. It was working earlier, but it's
Okay,
not
well, I'll
on,
stop.
so-
Oh, really? Okay, I'll stop.
so,
Let me go in and do that. There
so
we go.
meanwhile, I got a question for you.
Uh-huh. Let me turn this off here.
What's the difference between a new pilot and an old pilot?
Go ahead.
The new pilot says, "What's it doing now?" And the old pilot says, Look, it's doing it again.
There you go. You know, you know,
Um,
when we got to the Airbus, everybody said it takes about 6 months to really feel comfortable in that airplane, and that was really accurate. It really took that long.
yeah, when I transitioned to the glass panels, actually quite a long time ago now, I'm almost embarrassed to say, but yeah, it took several months to get really comfortable. And the point, one point I'll make on that is if you change your airplane or go buy a new airplane that's got this glass panel, don't go out and go jump in and go do an ILS to 200 feet and a half a mile right away. You
Mm,
need to practice with it.
yes. Yeah.
So let's see, we had a couple of things pop up here. George notes that the Garmin simulators don't always exactly match the airplane. You want to
Yeah.
expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I'll say this, no simulator exactly matches the airplane. I mean, we fly with the airlines in really nice level D simulators, and they're pretty close. But we're talking about simulators that cost as much as jet airplanes cost, and they're still not perfectly accurate. So yeah, you have to take it with a grain of salt. It's an education tool. It gets you familiar. But yes, it's not going to be exactly the same as the airplane, and you just have to sort of give that simulator leeway. No simulator will be.
Yeah, I've certainly found that too. And I've been instructing in simulators quite a bit lately, Redbird simulators mostly, and
Mhm.
their implementation of even a 430 or 530 or the G1000s I've been using, very little resemblance to the actual airplane I
Mm.
find. And if you've been following my Garmin programs, I use the Garmin simulator to simulate mostly the 530, but a little bit of 430. It's an older version of the software. It's 15 years old, doesn't match what's in the boxes now, and there's so many differences. But like Gary says, it does give you that kind of the general gist of the buttonology. So yeah, big grain of salt, I think,
Yeah.
is really important.
A lot of with the simulators, it's more of, with especially with using the Garmin's and these things, is where to find something, right? It's what you want to do. It's like, where is that, right? And in the heat of the moment when you're flying, it's hard. So by doing it at home when you're not under pressure, it makes it easy for you to know where to find the things. So yeah, they may not be perfectly accurate, but that's the real purpose of practicing at home. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't wait. I fly the 787 right now, and we've got these huge screens all over the place, and they're not touch screens. But I understand the new airplanes we're getting as of right now will be touch screens. So we're about to have fingerprints all over everything,
Right,
I'm
right.
sure.
But at least you could justify it then. I just, on a 737, why are there fingerprints on the
Yeah,
screen?
there's nothing that's touch
You
screen
don't
ever
need to
in that
go,
airplane.
look,
Yeah, and Santosh notes that the one thing that's odd in the G1000 display, and it's kind of similar in the others, in the Aspen and some others that I've flown with. I've flown with the G500 a little bit lately too. That splitting of the slip skid indicator and the rate of turn indicator being on two separate instruments now, where previously they were on one, the turn coordinator. Does that drive you as nuts?
Yeah, as I was talking about earlier with that, I find them to be, there's that issue, and I also find them to be a little too subtle in most glass airplanes. I would like to see a wider one with the indicator coming a little bit more matching it, where you could see it a little more easily. I don't know if that has to do with, as you get older, your eyes aren't as good, but I just, it seems to me on the glass airplanes, they're a little subtle. And I think maybe part of that is they just figure the glass airplane also has more sophisticated autopilots and you're not dealing with that issue as much. But, sometimes you need to be when you look at loss of control issues, right? Base to final and stuff, you certainly want to be looking at that turn coordinator.
Yeah, I agree. And I've struggled a little bit with pointing out to a learner, if you will, a student in the simulator, exactly where that rate of turn indicator is and what it means. It's not nearly as obvious where you had the little index mark was the standard rate turn on the old turn coordinator.
Right.
And now you got this little pink line that slips out, and there's a half rate mark and there's a full rate mark. And
right.
I have to hold a pencil over that. And okay, now start a turn. Now stop right there. That's a half rate. And it takes some time, takes a lot of practice.
The other thing that happens is you have the turn, the bank indicator at the top, and they work two different ways. Sometimes the bank indicator turns with the horizon. Sometimes it stays in place and a little needle does it. So you have to get used to that symbology. And that's a lot of it, is getting used to the symbology of the glass avionics.
Yeah, and that's been a problem from way back. Any longtime historians of aviation will remember the day the music died out there in Mason City, Iowa. And part of the problem on that flight that killed the Big Bopper and killed Richie Valens, and that was a different representation of the aircraft attitude on a new style of attitude indicator. It was a sky pointer instead of a bank pointer.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So that was a major contributing factor to that accident.
Hmm.
And I've seen both in the airplanes I've flown at the airline over the years. And what I point people to a lot is, if you look in, I believe it's the Instrument Flying Handbook, there's 2 chapters now with the same title, Basic Attitude Instrument Flying. One of them is for steam gauges and the other one is for glass gauges. And it focuses primarily on the G1000. So if you're thinking about flying with a G1000, that's a great resource. And that's official FAA guidance and handbook guidance. So that's pretty good. Let's see. And Michael asks, are there a series of...
See, folks, this is why Mike Jesh is my go-to guy. See, the information you get from him, it's constant. It's great.
Yeah. One of these days I got to turn that off somehow, I think. Michael asks in the Q&A here, are there a series of scenarios that you can use for practice in simulators?
Well, certainly, you want to know every phase of flight, really. So I would say you want to do a flight from takeoff to touchdown, a full flight, right? So because you're going to take off, well, you got to switch that mode and what kind of mode you're going to use. And I would do a full flight start to finish, and again, I would do it initially in the simulator in visual conditions where, get a look at that runway 20 miles away, and then look at how your needles are displaying to you. It'll give you a good idea of what it actually is like if you're going to be an IMC. Then you could lower it, the visibility and the conditions as you go.
Yeah, I agree. I like the way you laid this program out in that logical progression from takeoff to climb to cruise to descent to approach. That's a very reasonable, logical way to think about it. And Diane touches on that in one of her comments in the chat here. Learn the glass one piece at a time, and learn the practice of the primary flight instruments for a few hours, and then move to the engine monitoring, then to flight plans, and start with the basic attitude instrument flying display, and then bring in the other things. Is that a good way to do it, you think?
Yeah, I do, definitely. Certainly, because looking at the engine instruments, it's a secondary, if you want to call it that. When you're flying, you're looking at your old style 6-pack or the new style, right? But that's sort of the secondary instruments you're looking at. And so, yeah, I would definitely bite it off a piece at a time. Yeah.
Yeah, I know some flight schools that rent G1000 airplanes, they'll require 10 hours or at least 5 hours in a G1000 airplane before they'll sign you off to go take it solo. And interestingly, there's no endorsement required for flying a glass panel airplane, like there is for a complex or high performance.
Right.
And it wouldn't surprise me if we saw a required endorsement in a few years for that. It's a whole different way to fly.
Yep, it is.
And so it kind of begs the question, which do you think is better? Is it better to start on steam and transition to glass, or vice versa?
Well, I'm glad I started on steam. I'll say that. Because I feel like when things fall apart, I have no problem clicking it off and just flying the thing, and it doesn't bother me in the least. But it's the same thing. I would imagine it probably in the long run won't affect. It's just the way, we older people look at a 3-year-old and seem whipping away on an iPad. And I guess that'll just be the norm for the next generation, but I'm glad I learned on steam. I'll say that.
Yeah, I don't remember anything official, but I do remember somewhere reading an article or some piece in some magazine that talked about that. And it was, what they found was those pilots who started on a glass panel actually transitioned back to steam more easily than the other way around. It was opposite of what I was expecting when I started to read the article. So,
Mm. When I was doing training on the DC-9, that was a concern of ours. A lot of these young pilots were coming through and they were coming off of Canadairs and airplanes like that with glass cockpits. But most of them, like you say, most of them did a pretty good job of transitioning to the ancient DC-9.
Yeah, and by all means, when you begin this transition, you should raise your personal minimums in this new equipment until you've gained a certain amount of familiarity with it. And
Definitely.
Jolie Lucas has got a presentation. You can probably find some recordings of that online somewhere. Maybe she'll point out where she talks about this issue of personal minimums, and familiarity with your avionics should be a big part of that. Yeah. Yeah, Melissa says analog takes way less interpretation, I think, and I think that's true.
Yes.
Generally true, especially the later models when they standardized the layout in the panel. That made things a whole lot easier.
Yes.
And David is saying he thinks it's more likely that an endorsement will be required for steam gauges in the future.
Well, when it's no longer the norm, yeah, that could be.
Yeah, could be. Unless you flew one before such and such a date, you're grandfathered in. And,
right.
Yeah.
Right. You know, that's the thing. Yeah, and Mike, you and I have both gone through several type ratings in complex airplanes. And, no matter how hard it seems at first, once you get used to that airplane, that just becomes the norm. Right. And then every other airplane is more difficult.
Yep, that's true. After a certain amount of time, then it's hard to go back to the other way. And so it's one thing I'm kind of glad right now. I'm flying in a lot of different airplanes with a lot of different layouts of different navigators, different displays, and so I'm being able to keep fresh with everything a lot easier.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe they can teach an old dog new tricks. Let me see. Yeah, what's it doing now? Troubleshooting training is also a good idea. It's so much harder to troubleshoot these things in flight. And like you said, if you have an airspeed problem, that's an airspeed problem. But if you have an airspeed on a steam gauge airplane, if you're on a glass panel and you lose an airspeed, you might lose all kinds of things.
Yes, right.
You might lose your directional gyro, your HSI.
Right. This is that, like I talked about, how they're all kind of communicating with each other, and you have to get that interrelationship. Just to kind of, not exactly related, but just to show you how much that's true with the Airbus. It's 76 computers all talking to each other. One thing that that most surprised when I show them, hey, watch this. If you lose your air data computers, you can't get the landing gear down with the gear handle. It's like, what? Well, the landing gear computer won't allow you to drop the gear above 260 knots. Where does it get its information from? The air data computer. So it goes, will not compute, right? And so you have to understand that interrelationship that goes on between, just like that, between the different instruments. Yeah.
Yeah, I just did my recurrent training on the 787 last week, and we got a scenario very similar to that. And you see this list of things that don't work when you lose an air data computer or a primary flight control system. And it's a lot of stuff you don't necessarily think about that comes into play. And that's why, we don't try to memorize all these checklists. My quick reference handbook for the 787, if I printed it, would be about that thick. It's 1,500 some pages.
Right. So here's the quick reference handbook for the airplane I'm flying now, and you can see it's pretty thick. Yeah.
There's no way you could ever hope to remember all that stuff. So that's why we keep that handy there. So
yeah, but that's why your ICAS or whatever your system is comes up and shows you how to correct it, and then it shows you a big list of what's not working now. Right.
Yeah. Melissa talks about that she lost her airspeed on her last flight. She caught a B somehow, and mostly airspeed, but she also lost all the predictions, fuel time estimates, crosswind calculations. Everything goes away when you don't have that airspeed.
A B will do that to you.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's about all the questions we have here. So it's time to give away a prize.
Great. All right.
Do you want to do that, or you want me to do that?
Let's say, yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that, since you have the information in front of you?
Yes.
If you do have that information in front of you.
The first one is our precise flight oximeter, and that is going to go to, and she didn't tell me if this is a new member or an old member of Cal Pilots, but the name is Mark Swaney. So Mark Swaney, congratulations, you got yourself a pulse oximeter.
Right.
And Jolie should have all your information and she'll be getting that out to you. And the big ticket item though, the precise flight oxygen system. Do you have a picture you can throw up of that, Gary?
I do not.
Me neither. It makes two of us. But that's
Maybe Jolie does.
I believe it's a two-place precise flight oxygen bottle, cannulas, regulator,
Wow.
the whole shmool.
Nice.
So that is going to go to lucky Gordon Heinrichs. So congratulations, Gordon. You just won a really nice system there. You're going to like having that.
Well, how exciting.
And now you're going to have to go buy a precise flight oximeter, pulse oximeter, so you can monitor your status when you're flying.
Right. And don't scuba dive with that.
Right, that's a different thing. I've got another whole talk I've done where I talk about that pulse oximeter. A great tool. It doesn't help you for carbon monoxide poisoning. Did you know that?
No.
Carbon monoxide attaches to your blood cells in the same way that oxygen does, so the pulse oximeter cannot distinguish which is which.
Oh, that's not good.
It'll say you've got real good oxygen saturation when you don't. So that's all we've got for now. It's time to hand it over to Carol, who is going to give us our closing comments and our final prize of the day. So
Yes.
thanks again, Gary, for your presentation.
Thanks, everybody.